So, Lone Rider here, and I want to talk about when did the world turn into Crazyville, right? This is the 21st century. We're more connected to each other than ever before. I mean, you could email somebody in Timbuktu if you wanted, but yet for some reason, although it's, you know, easier than ever before to research information, people don't seem to be any better informed. Although people are more connected to each other than ever before, in some ways we've never been further apart. And I'm going to be honest, just because it's possible for you to correspond, let's say, with somebody on the other side of the world, doesn't mean that you're going to be capable of having a civil discussion with the person who lives next door to you. Why? Well, that's not a matter of technological advancement. That's a matter of what you believe and how you were taught. And how people are taught and how they act nowadays is very different than in the past. Now, one of the things about being of a certain age, I mean, I was growing up in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, and I remember, well, late 80s through, let's say, mid 90s, and I remember a time when people would say things like, and not as a joke, they would say it and they would mean it. You know, I disagree with what you're saying, but I defend your right to say it. Nowadays, it's, I disagree with what you're saying, and so, therefore, it's hate speech, and you should be taken out and locked up, or made to sit in a corner wearing a dunce hat, or deplatformed, or, you know, whatever. And, wow. So we've gone from a principled, moral, ethical stand, defending a universal, you know, individual human right of free expression, and the societal benefit that comes from an open exchange of information as well, to basically throwing a temper tantrum because you hear something you don't like. That seems to be the, by the way, temper tantrum seems to be the way politics are going now, right? If you ask a question about global warming, you're a denier, go sit in the corner. If you don't agree with every single gun control proposal, you're an evil fiend who wants dead kids. You have blood on your hands. If you, you know, have any question about maybe should we have better border security, you're a bigot. You're literally Hitler. What is wrong with people? Well, what's wrong with people is that at some point between when I was growing up and now, we normalized grown adults acting like 5-year-olds. I honestly don't know when it happened or how. I mean, there's you know, let's say philosophical pointers that could, you know, maybe be clues suggesting that this or that had something to do with it. You know, and a lot of these changes in society, they'll be hinted at, and then 10, 15, 20 years later, they'll actually come to fruition. So I don't believe this happened overnight, by the way. But, you know, at the end of the day, for whatever reason, we've gone from a society where people are, they might vehemently disagree, but they're at least willing to have a discussion about current events. Now, they don't even want to have a discussion. It's just, if you disagree with me, you're evil, and, like, I'm not even going to listen to you. In fact, you shouldn't even be allowed to speak. And it's kind of funny, because, I mean, I do remember hints of that. I remember this one letter to the editorial, rather, in the not Investors Business Daily. What was the name of that paper? USA Today. It's one editorial from USA Today from the 1990s. I specifically remember this. I was in high school. We had a substitute, and I was reading the paper during science class because there was a substitute. There wasn't any actual lecture material going on. And the one editorial was, it said, "Is our freedom of speech too free?" And it was discussing what, at the time, it was claiming was the turning of modern politics more uncivil by people using harsh and raw language and hyperbole. And it suggested that we should either self-censor or something may have to be done to restrict this type of political speech. And I remember I made notes when I read this editorial for a letter to the editor, which I don't know if I ever sent it in, but it was going to be sent in response. At the time, I was sending a lot of letters to the editor to newspapers, most notably the Star Ledger, a major New Jersey newspaper, even though I was, at the time, only about 16. But they were publishing them because they were written like an adult wrote them, so they didn't know who I was. And I don't know if I ever sent this particular one into USA Today, but I do remember one line where I specifically addressed the issue, and this is just verbatim off the top of my head. It's every once in a while something occurs and you just remember it. And this was, let me see, what was the exact words? If I can, was, oh yeah, quote, "The most toxic speech is that which condemns or questions the freedom of speech. Yet that is allowed and even protected. Why? Because that is the essence of freedom of speech," unquote. And that, again, I'm remembering off the top of my head something that I wrote over 20 years ago. But I remember that, and I remember the line "toxic speech" and the actual title of the editorial, which was, "Is Our Freedom of Speech Too Free?" And the reason I remember this is because, you know, growing up in this country where freedom of speech is a big thing, that, you know, one of the basic 10 Amendments of the Bill of Rights guarantees the legal recognition of this. And to have somebody openly questioning it in an editorial, I thought was abhorrent. So I thought about a response. Now, I don't remember whether I actually sent that in. I do know it was never published, but I don't remember whether I sent it and they didn't publish it, or I didn't send it in. But anyway, so that's an example where this idea of if somebody disagrees with you, they shouldn't be allowed to speak. It does have roots going back in this country years, but it was always a very fringe idea until somehow it wasn't, right? And I'm not entirely sure what happened in the intervening years, but somehow we normalized this approach. We normalized the approach of grown adults acting like children throwing temper tantrums. And on any issue, whether it's, you know, healthcare, immigration enforcement, foreign policy, gun control, whatever. On any issue, if you disagree with the wrong person, their response isn't to respond to you. It's to throw a temper tantrum and, out, out. Yeah. And like I said, I'm old enough to remember before this was a thing. I'm old enough I can remember when people would say, instead of, "I disagree with you and therefore you should just shut the F up and go over there," I remember when people used to say things like, and not ironically, but actually mean it, they used to say things like, "I disagree with you, but I defend your right to say what you're saying." And people don't talk like that anymore. But I'm going to be honest. I think they should. However, to talk like that, you need to think like that, right? It's the underlying mindset that needs to change. It's the underlying ideas. And I think there's more going on here than people just being, you know, easily triggered emotional jerks. I do think it's interesting that even abstract political issues are discussed now, not even discussed, but are talked about with the kind of, you know, fanatical, over-the-top shouting that you would usually see in somebody who's in extreme physical pain, such as the survivor of an accident being, you know, driven in an ambulance to the hospital. It's almost as if these people go through life like in constant pain or stress, and that's why they're reacting this way. The question is then, why are they under constant pain or stress? I honestly don't know. It could be because their worldview hasn't equipped them to deal with reality. And for some, that may be the case. There are, you know, good philosophies and bad philosophies and middling philosophies. And some approaches don't equip you for dealing very well with the real world. That may be it. I don't know. For some of them anyway. But I can't think of... It's like, okay, even if there was a small group of people who, you know, were brought up with some bizarro theory that, you know, left them frustrated when they tried to deal with everyday things, you know, nevertheless, talking about the entire country, right? It's not just a question of a handful of people here, a handful of people here. There's been a cultural shift, almost nationwide. Now, a lot of this does appear to be on the left, but there are extremists on the right, too. And not just extremists, but people who fly off the handle as well. So you can't even really say it's entirely a leftist thing. I do believe it seems to be more prominent on the left, but I don't know if that's just because they encourage it more. You know, when somebody on the right freaks out, usually it makes the newspapers, and not in a good way. So, whereas when people on the left freak out, you know, they're described as, you know, it's like, oh, they're bravely taking a stand, as opposed to shouting at the top of their lungs like a drunk idiot. So I honestly don't know. Maybe it's just how we react to it and how the media reacts to it makes it seem like it's more on one side than the other. I don't know. But the point is, there has been a widespread change in how people conduct themselves. And I don't think it's just, you know, like somebody flipped a switch and everybody woke up the other day an asshole. Excuse my language. I think this has been a long time coming. It's a result of underlying ideas that have changed. And like I said, it would be nice if people could talk like that again. Could say things like, I disagree with what you're saying, but I respect and defend your right to say it. That's how I think. But, you know, I guess I'm in the minority here on that, at least in some circles. And the problem is, to be able to talk like that, you got to be able to think like that. And a lot of these people don't think like that anymore. And it's a damn shame because, like I said, we're in the 21st century. We're more connected than ever, at least in pragmatic terms, in terms of what you can physically do with the technology and the innovation to hand in society. And yet, although I can Skype with a person across the world in Timbuktu, I might not necessarily be able to even have a politically civil discussion with my next door neighbor. Why? Well, again, it's not just about technology. It's about your mindset and how you think and how you act. And you could disagree with somebody without thinking that they sleep in Hitler's pajamas, or that they're, you know, somebody disagrees with you. Oh my God, you're literally Hitler. Do these people know what literally means? Anyway, we need to, like, seriously look around and say to ourselves, this is the 21st century. This isn't the 12th century. This is the 21st century. We can and should do better. We have no reason not to do better. Why don't we? Right? There's nothing, in practical terms, stopping us. The only thing stopping us is our own limited mindsets. And, you know, you control what goes in your own mind. As one author I remember reading once wrote, mind is like a home. If it's, you know, it's furnished by its owner. If you find it, you know, bare and cold and empty, you got no one to blame but yourself. And rather than sit around blaming ourselves, why don't we get busy at, you know, acting like we all want to actually live together in this country? Because we kind of have to, right? You may, you know, on your social media, you may be like, well, I'll just live in my own little bubble and that's fine. Yeah, what happens when you go to the supermarket and see somebody wearing a hat you don't like? Are you going to freak out and go, you know, go bonkers and get yourself tased by the cops? We cannot continue to exist in this mentality of, you know, people, when it comes to politics or issues of the day or anything controversial, people just revert to 5-year-olds. We can't continue doing that. Lone Rider out.